Good afternoon and welcome to this live broadcast of Machiavelli Talks, the English language series by the Machiavelli Center for Political and Strategic Studies. I'm Daniele Scalea and today we are going to talk about the Russian-Ukrainian War and its consequences for NATO and Europe with three distinguished guests. From Washington, D.C., Dr. James J. Carafano, Vice President of Heritage Foundations, Catherine and Shelby Callum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. Thank you for being here with us. And from Budapest, Dr. Attila Demko, head of Mathias Corvinus Collegium Center for Geopolitics. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And finally, from Florence, well known to our regular audience, Mr. Guglielmo Picchi, member of the Italian Parliament and former Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs. Good to see you
Hi,
again,
everyone.
Guglielmo.
Ciao, Daniele.
Naturally, thanks also for joining to our audience. If you are listening to this live, do not forget to hit the like and make sure to comment below, especially if you want to ask anything to our guest. We begin our discussions with a question to Dr. Carafano. Shortly before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, reportedly made the prediction that Kiev would not hold out for more than 72 hours. Was this gross miscalculation by the U.S. military, or was the Ukrainian reaction utterly surprising and unpredictable? And most importantly, how did this miscalculation affect the American reaction to the Russian attack?
Because there you go. That's a great question. If people are interested in that, I actually just recently wrote a piece on this for Fox News. So this assessment came in a I believe it was a closed door briefing to Congress, and his prediction was that the invasion would last about 72 hours. Now that clearly, in retrospect, that was based on looking at an analysis of the Russian military plan, and I think from what we've seen from physical evidence available through looking at deployments on Google Earth and other places, and other information that's publicly available, that does appear to bend kind of the Russian plan, that there would be that they would disrupt the government in Kyiv on day one or two, and that the expectation is there wouldn't be an organized military resistance, and that the scheme was really for the rapid occupation of Ukraine rather than a more deliberate fighting war. And I do think it impacted a significant miscalculation on the part of the U.S. and also I think demonstrated a real kind of flaw in our approach to the conflict. What we did was essentially say, well, this is the Russian plan. Well, anybody and I was in the military for 25 years, anybody that's ever seen any war knows that no plan survives contact with the enemy. And also that if you're going to analyze combatants, you have to go beyond just looking at their planning and looking at a deeper assessment of their capabilities and organizations. So what he didn't provide to the Congress, and we don't know, of course, if he provided this president, was there wasn't an in-depth analysis of Russian capabilities, of the state of training, military logistics. There also wasn't a very sophisticated assessment of the Ukrainian military. Excuse me. And having visited Ukraine, I think the last time was in 2017. There's obviously been some pretty significant changes in how Ukraine is organized to defend the country. I mean, several years ago, sorry, we have really bad allergies here in Washington, D.C. Several years ago, the Ukrainian military was primarily designed to skirmish along the line of contact between the Russian occupation forces in Crimea. Obviously, there's been a significant restructuring of Ukrainian defense plans. I don't think that was taken into account either. And so if you look at kind of how the U.S. went into this operation, very clearly their assumption on the front end was the Ukrainians would not be able to defend themselves. And so the initial US response was, let's do nothing to antagonize the Russians and preempt or trigger an invasion. And then once the invasion happened, the US response was, well, let's do nothing because it won't be worth it because these guys won't last but a couple of days. And then as the war lengthened, the US response was, well, let's not do anything that might exacerbate the conflict and further antagonize the Russians. And I think if you look at the timeline, it's really only when we got about 3 weeks into the war that the US position moved to, well, the Ukrainians can obviously hold out, so providing them more robust defensive capabilities. And we've kind of seen the level of escalation the Russians are willing to go to. You know, as a military analyst, you know, this to me seems pretty poor, because what we're basically doing is kind of responding to events on the ground, and we're not doing contingency planning. We're not looking at, you know, different outcomes, and we're not proactively responding to this. So I actually think it reflects rather poorly on the state of the U.S. response. And I can't be 1,000% clear of where this breakdown comes, of whether it's in the White House or in the advice for military planners or somewhere in between. But I think that's the assessment that we can make kind of from the outside looking in. So thank you for the question.
Thank you for the, Dr. Demko. In one of your books from 2019, you wrote that Putin is not mad but furious, and predicted that cornered in Ukraine, he would react harshly. What do you think Putin's initial plans were, and what they might be now after the failure of the battle for Kiev and with a looming offensive in the Donbass?
Yes, thank you for your question. I do believe that Putin is not mad, but he doesn't have the full picture. Nobody has the full picture, and actually Putin, and I think the Russian elite believe that they can deal with Ukraine like they dealt in 2014, with a swift operation, with minimal resistance. We should remember Crimea. There were 2 or 3 dead during the whole operation. Most of the Ukrainian army melted. And I think he got very bad intelligence, and this is partly because of how the system works. I wrote in my book a very similar scene to what happened to Sergei Narishkin, the head of SVR, when he was humiliated in front of, I don't know, 100 million Russians on live TV. So this is not a system where you know, it's easy to convey the truth upon power. And I think it was lost somewhere in the chain. What is the real state of the Ukrainian military? What is the real state? And this is more important. What is the real state of the Russian military? And this is the reason. I'm very surprised with this war. So actually, I have to say that I was so wrong, like maybe never before on an issue, because I thought that Putin would start to undermine NATO and the EU before starting a war in Ukraine. But he started with Ukraine, and I think he now is in a trap. So actually, I don't think it's like plan A, B, C, D. There was only one plan A, and they stick to this plan A for a month, which is, you know, I know Ukraine quite well. I've been to the front lines. I've been maybe 50 times in Ukraine, and I saw the change in Ukrainian army from the beginning, from 15 until even in 2 years, there was a big change. So I don't know how the information didn't get to Moscow, that it's an improved army and with a higher morale, higher salaries, for example. I mean, there was a huge salary raise within the Ukrainian army. So what I would say that they had a plan A, and it took them 1 month to realize that this plan A doesn't work. And now they are at plan B, but they have to work on plan B now because they didn't have it pre-planned. And plan B is, of course, the destruction of the Ukrainian concentration of troops in the Donbass, and this is very logical. So actually, I was not being a military expert, but still, I could saw it on the map that they should do it from a Russian perspective now for more than a month, and they started they didn't even start the large-scale operation yet in the Donbass. So they are still waiting for reinforcements. The weather is bad. So I think this is now the time for Plan B, and they are desperate.
Guglielmo Picchi, Italy has traditionally been one of the EU countries at the forefront of fostering a dialogue with Russia, most memorably Berlusconi's activism in this regard when he was head of government, which clashes with the fact that while both French President Macron and German Chancellor Scholz went to Moscow to talk to Putin in the weeks before the invasion to try to avert it, Italian Prime Minister did not, Draghi did not, nor has he shown much diplomatic activism in the past 2 months. To what are we to blame for these? Shortcomings on the part of the government, or is it the objective demotion of Italy's rank among nations and powers?
The easy answer is that they are missing a good foreign minister. So I'm not on the job, so that's the main reason. But apart from the joke, let's say that Italy was a good, for the West, was well positioned to dialogue, to engage the Russians. And the more you keep them at the table, the better it was for everyone. The problem is that the 24th of February, everything changed, and a dialogue and trying to engage them as we were trying before, became worthless. Furthermore, all the attacks on civilians and all the potential war crimes that we have seen on screen makes this dialogue almost impossible. But of course, in order to reach a ceasefire, that is the only thing that we should aim in the short term, is that a dialogue is needed. And for, let's say that the Italian Prime Minister, Italy in general, has not done much. Maybe there is something that is that we don't know, that is not being shared to Parliament, and maybe there is some hidden dialogue and some hidden channel of communication open to Putin and to the Russian elite. But it's true what you were saying, that Macron is trying to engage so far with, let's say, very low success, Mr. Putin, the same to the Germans. Instead, Italy was nowhere on the map or nowhere in the dialogue. That's a shame. At some point, there was always some signals, open signals from the Russians that, some sort of engagement of the Italians would have been appreciated. For instance, at the first round of talks, to have the Belarusian flag between that of the Ukrainians and the Russian was not a very reassuring image, because they cannot be, Lukashenko be the guarantor of neither part, maybe of the Russian, but for sure not that. So if the EU, or I say Italy, was well positioned to do so, was trying to engage and to be on the table, that would have been very useful to have a more proactive approach. The other thing is that you mentioned that we have a number of politicians that were old pals with Putin, and we have recently known that Berlusconi tried a number of phone calls to Putin, who were never answered, got never an answer. But in order to instruct someone to be a sort of mediator, or at least someone who should try to put the people on around the table, has to receive a sort of mandate. Italy never, gave a mandate to Berlusconi or to any other to try to engage Putin. So if you don't have your prime minister either flying or even trying a phone call in 45 days of war, the same the foreign minister, well, then the role of the country is negligible, and that's the situation right now. And we are the one that are taking with Germany the highest economic impact on the sanctions. I always remember that up to 40% of our supply of gas comes from Russia. We don't have enough LNG terminals to import the shortfall if we cut the supply from the Russians, and there is no European solidarity whatsoever in terms of subsidies or any sort of help to our industries and to other people in case we go for a full cut of Russian gas. So yes, Italy has been not on the map is mainly due to a lack of activism of the government. I tried a couple of times in Parliament speaking directly openly to Mr. Draghi to have at least a phone call. The only answer I got is that Mr. Picchi, you are a friend of Mr. Putin. Well, yes, Mr. Draghi, you just forgot that I said in Parliament right in front of you, Slava Ukraini. If someone says glory to Ukraine, cannot be really a friend of Mr. Putin.
Connected to what Guglielmo Picchi has just said, sanctions on Russia pose a challenge to many European countries, especially those most dependent on Russian gas imports, such as Italy, Germany, Austria, Hungary. Here, there is a strong fear that there could be a halt in supplies that would generate serious socio-economic crisis. Dr. Carafano, many in Europe hope for a strong support from the USA, which is the top producing country of both oil and gas. However, the increase in gas production in the USA is for now well below the increase in demand for export. Right. The US natural gas futures have reached a 13-year high. We also know that the Biden administration is not exactly friendly to the fossil fuel industry. Do we in Europe need to scale back expectations of relief from America?
Actually, I think it's the opposite. I think Europeans ought to put more demands on the Americans. I don't mean to be picking on the Americans because I'm an American, but for six consecutive quarters in the run-up to the war in Ukraine, global demand exceeded global supply. So that meant for basically the entire time that Biden was in office, the world was cutting into its global reserves to meet its energy needs. So going into the Ukraine war, the consequences of restrictions in supply or energy sanctions was incredibly apparent, and yet we did nothing in anticipation of that. No, so there was no contingency for that. So I think that is a problem on our end. And the reality is, even now, 45 days into the war, there is no federal effort to encourage rapid increases in production. And honestly, I think that this is a long-term issue. So it is actually vitally important that American production, which has vast opportunity, because the infrastructure is already there. I mean, we could talk about European production and new gas fields and everything else, but you have to develop those. But the European, I mean, the American fields and the capacity and the workforce is already there. So the U.S. production capability is literally, other than Saudi Arabia just and pumping more, probably the most near-term immediate way we could get more commodity on the market. So and I think European pressure on the United States would actually help a great deal. Because there's a lot of domestic pressure for this. Even among Americans are very concerned about climate. We understand the importance of that. But if you look across the board in the U.S., Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, there's a lot of broad recognition for the importance of increasing production. So so there's already an American demand for this, and I think a European demand would put more pressure on the U.S. government to do that. So if I could just a real quick word on sanctions, I think a lot of the problem here is we misunderstand the role of sanctions in conflict. Sanctions are obviously not really an effective deterrent. Russians reminded us of that. They're also not really that good to punish, because as we know, regimes can always find a way to make money for the stuff that they want. North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned regime on the planet, and yet they found plenty of money to build one of the world's foremost nuclear weapon programs. So what sanctions do is they provide less resources to the country, and that forces the leaders in the countries to make hard choices, often that are suboptimal. And so it's not a magic bullet answer to the problem, but what it does is it does put that competitor in a more complicated space. So they're actually quite useful. And so in the case, for example, of energy, I think it's completely understandable that in the short term there are countries that just can't stop buying Russian oil and gas. I mean, that's just obvious, because their economies would grind to a halt. And conversely, the Russians are going to keep selling them, even if they're supporting Ukraine, because the Russians need the money. But the point is, I think you have to look at the economies in the aggregate. Yeah, maybe they're making money from oil and gas, but the global pressure of other restrictions are, because a ruble is a ruble, whether you made it off of gas or you made it off of something else. If you have less rubles, if you have less money, less access to the global economy, that is pressure on you. So I think we need to be more realistic about sanctions. Some of this I think is quite silly. For example, people have gone after India. India actually buys, I think, less than 2% of its oil and gas from Russia. That is not really a significant activity. So to kind of attack the Indians, I don't think really, for all the other things the Indians do for so many of us in collective security, doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'd like to see more realism injected into this. And I actually think the Europeans have been generally quite reasonable and quite helpful on this front. And but I just think it's because we have to have realistic expectations of what we can expect from sanctions, and we also have to balance that with, it does no good for us to do more damage to ourselves than we do to put pressure on the Russians. We have to balance those. I think it's just realism. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to listen also to Dr. Demko opinion on this matter.
So we have to separate emotions and outrage we feel over what Putin's army is doing in Ukraine and the realities. And the reality is that we could hurt ourselves more with the sudden sanctions. I mean, like Italy, Germany, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, and many other countries cannot change from gas and even from oil easily. I tell you a few facts. For example, in the case of Hungary, it's 85% Russian gas. We tried to diversify. We talked to the Romanians of having a pipeline from the Black Sea. There is a huge field called Neptune Deep, and it wasn't exploited because of debates within the Romanian government, because of debates with ExxonMobil. That's a big problem now, because it's a big field. We also tried before, before 2020, to have gas from other sources. In the 2000s, we tried the Nabucco pipeline, which would have both in Iranian and Azeri. So Hungary tried to diversify. We also connected with Poland, Slovakia, interconnector oil and gas pipelines, which helped a bit now. And we also supported the LNG port in Croatia. LNG is important. And Hungary, it's not well known. We are the bad sheep in this, always in international media, but in reality, we try to diversify for 15 years from Russia. And somehow all these projects, Nabucco, the Romanian pipeline project, the LNG project is not big enough. and interconnectors are not big enough. So what we would face is the collapse basically of our economy, and there are many other countries like that, not only Hungary. So what would happen to Russia? Just let's count. What would happen to Russia? They have still about $200 billion in reserve. They can sell to China. They can sell to India. Yes, it's small now, but they are negotiating with India to sell 30-40% cheaper than market prices oil. And at the end of the day, they could survive for basically years. As we count, they could survive for 1 or 2 years without any exports to Europe or to the Western world. Can we survive that long? I'm not that sure. But actually, I'm not that much afraid about our sanctions. I'm afraid of Russia switching it off for one reason or another reason. And what is not well known, and I really admire the fight the Ukrainians are fighting, and because this is bravery, and we have a huge Alamo now in Mariupol fighting till the last bullet, and this has to be respected. But when they talk about energy sanctions, they always forget to say that actually Hungarians, Slovaks get the oil and gas from Russia through Ukraine. And every day Ukraine gets money from Russia for the transfer of oil and gas. And somehow it is forgotten when we hear these speeches. So I think we have to be rational about this. What would happen to Ukraine if the flow of gas and oil is stopped? The first thing Russians would do, of course, not to pay for Ukraine. The second they would do, and I think Putin is capable to do it, destroy the gas infrastructure and oil infrastructure of Ukraine. 90% of Ukrainian fields. Ukraine has a huge internal production of natural gas, but they are next to Russia. They are in Poltava Oblast, they are in Kharkov Oblast, part of it is in the Donbass. So can you imagine if there is no gas running to Europe and no oil? What is the Russian interest to keep Ukrainian gas infrastructure intact? They would destroy it. As far as I know the Russians, they would destroy it without mercy. And if the gas infrastructure is destroyed in Ukraine, you cannot easily replace it. And then Ukraine will have an extremely hard winter next year. 2022-23 winter without gas and oil, that would be extremely hard. I can tell you that Hungary can provide, if there is enough gas coming from the west for Kiev, gas, and we are providing gas right now. It's not really in the media that we are giving gas and fuel every day to Ukraine. But it wouldn't be possible if we don't have enough ourselves. So it's an extremely problematic question. We have to be realist. Emotions and outrage is one thing, but we are not helping Ukraine with emotions and outrage. We are helping Ukraine if we tell Russians that we will never accept their plan for Ukraine to be under Russia. We have to make it very clear to Russia that if it takes 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, we will never accept it. We will never accept conquest, and I think that is one of the things we have to make very clear.
Let's say on Hungary, Orban's Fidesz recently achieved an electoral success of unexpected size. Some analysts believe that Orban's caution about Hungary's involvement in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict also paid off, while the Márki-Zay-led opposition was more interventionist. However, this has brought hard accusations to Orban, who has been reprimanded even by the Ukrainian President Zelensky, and described in the press of many European countries, for example, Italy, as Putin's ally. How would you describe the position of the Budapest government with respect to the war that is being fought in a directly neighboring country of Hungary?
So I think before the 24th of February, we had the correct relationship with Russia. And because of, let's say, historical and national minority issues, we had bad relationship with Ukraine. So this is the starting point. I don't want to go deep into history, but this is something very important for Hungary, how Hungarian culture, language, and history is treated. And there were very serious misunderstanding and also I don't want to go into details because Ukraine is massacred now by Russia, so it's very small. Our problems are very small compared to that what's happening today with Ukraine. As for the problems, let's say the criticism of President Zelensky, again, he's leading a country which is massacred today. So emotions and hard words, I think we should accept it. But it was an election campaign, and election campaigns are very, very touchy periods. So I think there was a verbal fight between Prime Minister Orban and President Zelensky, and it created, unfortunately, even more misunderstanding in the relationship. But the reality is that Hungary is voting in the United Nations, in NATO and EU, 100% with the majority position of the West. We are outraged by what Putin is doing. The Hungarian president, prime minister, parliament labeled Russia as the aggressor. And yes, we are not on board with all of the sanctions yet, but we need solutions, as I said before. And also the military aid, it's again a tricky subject, but there is many news which are fake news compared to that, connected to that. It's true that Hungary is not giving lethal weapons, but we are aiding Ukraine with accepting more than 500,000 refugees. We're giving fuel, we're giving food, we're offering hospitals. So it's a much more nuanced issue than that. Hungary is firmly in the Western camp, and I think anybody who had any illusions about Russia, they are losing it. Maybe in some heads, this is not fast enough. We have to fight Russian propaganda for sure in Hungary. Unfortunately, because of the bad relations in the last few years with Ukraine, Russia had a bridgehead in some heads in Hungary. And I have to tell you one thing which is not well known. Russia was always trying to undermine Ukrainian-Hungarian relations, including with fast flag operations, which means that Russian agents attacked Hungarian ethnic minority. Russian agents used the SMSs, messages to frighten Hungarian minority. And we know that these, death threats, and these were initiated by Russia. There were other attacks, physical attacks by Russia. So the full picture is very gray. But I think if you look at what Hungary is doing, and beyond the let's say the messages coming from President Zelensky and some counter messages, if you look at what is happening in reality, then Hungary, you will see that Hungary is with Ukraine. Maybe not as far, and surely not as far as Poland or the United States. But then you have to, if I to explain it, why not? We would spend a few hours here. So let me finish with that we have to work on this relationship in the future. But first of all, the Russian invasion must stop.
As mentioned before, Italy is among the countries most dependent on gas imports from Russia. It imports almost all of the gas it consumes, and of these 40% is from Russia. The economy is already faltering after a 2-year period of severe anti-COVID restrictions. Guglielmo Picchi, do you think Italy should and could do without Russian gas and oil?
Well, let's say that when I was back in government in 2018, we had the chance to kick off the East Med gas pipeline. I remember I was already booked to fly to Israel for the kickoff of the project, and then the government I was part of, the majority of the coalition, said that this is a very costly project, useless, and that we had already enough diversification of pipelines that brought gas to Italy. And the gas was so cheap that we didn't need one pipe more. The reality is that over the last 20 years, the energy policy of Italy was very weak, was very blind. we abdicated to building a number of LNG terminals, which would have been very useful right now. We never proceed to complete the TAP, the gas pipeline that comes from Azerbaijan. There was a fight that lasted many years in order to build the last piece. They had to cross a nice piece of land with 50 olive trees, and all the environmentalists and even the current foreign minister was objecting to that. And I found it almost hilarious to see that our foreign minister, the one who opposed the completion of the TAP, so the Azeri gas coming to Italy, was then in Azerbaijan in front of President Aliyev, demanding for doubling this pipeline and increasing the flow of gas from that part of the world. The reality is that so we were not very pragmatic in trying to diversify our energy sources. We believed in decarbonizing our economy without any sustainable transition that made also our industries often out of market in terms of pricing. So we were not very intelligent how we handled the entire situation. If we add to that also in the renewables, we have a red tape that is almost incredible. So to build any sort of wind farm or to have the solar fields to be installed in Italy, you need so many authorization and regulatory stuff that it's almost impossible to realize, to diversify. So in short, we were self-harming, and but so far, I mean, at least when the war started, Mr. Draghi and the foreign minister, also because the parliament voted a resolution obliging them to do so, they started to fly all around the world, in Algeria, in Angola, in Mozambique, by the Qataris, the Saudis, Azerbaijan, Libya itself, in order to find the gas that we need to replace the Russian gas. It's doable, it's achievable, it's 29 billion cubic meter of gas, and I'm pretty optimistic by mid 2023, so in 12 months' time, we are able to replace almost all the Russian gas. Let me add something on sanction. I totally agreed with both Mr. Carafano and Mr. Demko. Sanctions are not per se effective in achieving a result, but put the country who is subject to sanction in the elite in a position to take very difficult choices vis-a-vis the population, and this create tensions, problems. We know that the sanctions, I mean, in Cuba were not very effective, although they lasted 60 years. The same we might say for Iran and North Korea. So regimes try to be very resilient to sanctions. Sooner or later, the country will, the people in the country will, get hit so much that the ability of their government to engage in complex activities abroad, I mean, is highly reduced. So on the long run, sanction will function. One point that I would make on the opening, that the question that you made to Mr. Carafano. U.S. intelligence was not very good in understanding that the Afghan army could hold more than a couple of months, and then it lasted maybe 2 weeks. The same here in Ukraine, but I would say they were not alone. No one. The mistake is shared, in most of Western intelligence community. Although I remember I flew to Kramatorsk and to the line of contact when I was deputy foreign minister in 2019, and I saw that at least in that part of the country, the Ukrainian army was well equipped, both in terms of small arms, in terms of gear, protective gear, helmets, body armor, that stuff. That was a significant change to what I've seen, a few years ago when I was in 2011 in Crimea, where I was almost a material army made of, volunteers, and so that was a big shift. And for what is my understanding, and I would like to hear the opinion of both Demko and Carafano, I'm starting to be convinced that the logistic failure of both in terms of food and ammunition and gasoline that the Russian army is not able to deliver on the front line might reserve us, possibly a collapse of the Russian initiatives in Donbass. So I would like to hear your opinion on this. Thank you.
Maybe we can start from Dr. Carafano.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't fault any intelligence for getting it wrong. What I fault people for, and I fault my country as much as anyone, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, is not planning for contingencies when things don't go as expected. I mean, that should be axiomatically part of a planning for war. Things inevitably go way better or way worse than you thought. And if you're not sitting down and planning for those contingencies, then I don't think you're actually doing real military planning. Anybody can plan for what they want to happen. Look, I think the root of this in the U.S. it's probably a political military problem. I'm not sure it's 100% on either side, but I think it's a serious thing that we need some real serious introspection on. I would say, I think, again, not predicting, but if you just look at what's out there today, it seems that there's 3 things that Putin wants to do. He keeps bringing up May 9th as kind of the natural date for a culmination of military action. Obviously, the anniversary of the Russian victory in the Great Patriotic War. So, and he's publicly said this on numerous occasions. It does seem like he's trying to stack up a couple of things to stop the conflict on the most favorable terms for him, and where he has maximum pressure on the Ukrainians. So one of them that we haven't really discussed is the attacks on civilians. Appear widespread and deliberate but it seems like to put additional pressure on Ukrainians. Don't you want to stop fighting? Aren't you tired of having your cities leveled and everything else? So the other one is that we also don't discuss is the hundreds of thousands, I guess, of Ukrainians who've been forcibly repatriated to Russia. That's a bargaining chip. And I think the third piece that Putin would take to the table is to end in a militarily favorable situation. And so I think obviously the overthrowing of the Ukrainian regime is not realistic at this point. And so it's, they even said this, they're massing for an attack in the south. There are some real issues there. They talk about 60, 70,000 troops, which honestly doesn't sound really all that impressive from a couple of perspectives. One is, how many troops can you get at the front at one time? And the weather's getting worse. being off-road in Ukraine is really hard. So they haven't demonstrated the real ability to do real fire and maneuver. And I just think changing military commanders, telling me that the Russians are going to fight way better, that doesn't seem realistic. The Ukrainians know they're coming. There's not a lot of subtlety here. There aren't a lot of different ways you can do an offensive. The Ukrainians are probably much more reluctant now to do operations from the sea because of that's more dangerous for them. They can't dominate the air. So if they're going to attack, it does seem that they have to attack in relatively obvious ways in which they know with coming, with a relatively narrow point of the sphere, with a significantly depleted tank corps. And you cannot, and having done this, you cannot turn logistics on their heads and make them go from horrible to good in 40 days. You can't do that, particularly since it does seem that a fair amount of the Russian shortfall is corruption as much as anything else, that food and resources and gasoline have been diverted or used for other. So that doesn't solve in 40 days. So you add all that up, and I think Putin's determined to throw a lot of people into this war, but whether he can really have some kind of significant military success, I think that's an open question.
I turn the question to Dr. Demko.
I only know about what open sources tell us. I don't have any deeper knowledge of what is happening on the ground. But I can tell you what common sense tells me. Common sense tells me that Russians are slow learners, but they are learning from their mistakes. And it's far easier to supply troops in the Donbass than it was in the Kiev region with very long supply lines. It will be even more easier if they capture Mariupol with a port with a 14-meter deep water, so the big ships can use it. And in Mariupol, a brigade-sized Ukrainian force will be basically destroyed in a few days after a truly heroic fight. So we don't really know how is the Ukrainian military. We are in the Western information bubble. I have to warn every viewer. We are in the Western information bubble. We know that the Russians lost a lot, but we don't know how much the Ukrainians lost. I'm trying to contact my Ukrainian sources, but they are not telling anything about it. I don't think they know, but even if they would know, they couldn't tell us. So we don't know about the state of the Ukrainian army much. So what I see that Kiev was militarily a very hard operation. It's an area with forests. It's an area very close to the Ukrainian seat of power, and it's a big city. It's a city of 3 million. How Donbass looks? So I extensively traveled along the front line from the Luhansk region down to Mariupol, and the Mariupol region is actually a pretty open space. And Russians did quite well on the open spaces in the south. It suits their military tactics. The north is trickier. North of Sloviansk, there are forests, valleys, rivers. So it's harder. There is a very big forest just north of Sloviansk. This is the national park of the Holy Mountain. That's not easy to penetrate. This is the region of from Izium down to Sloviansk. So what I see that Russians have more advantages in this area than in other theaters they had. Ukrainians are entrenched. That's for sure true, but not everywhere. So if the Russians make an attempt to encircle them and slowly strangle the Ukrainian force, that may work. But I'm sure in one thing, that it's not going to work until May the 9th. So that's if they try to do it until May the 9th and try to just throw troops to strong defenses without taking into consideration weather, troop morale, logistics, then they can lose. If they are a bit more patient than they have been before, it depends on the state of the Ukrainian military. But anybody who has ever been to a front line knows that even if an army puts up a very good fight, artillery and air force matters, and in that Russians have the advantage. So there can be a crack in Ukraine. So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm not that optimistic about that. So I would say that it's at best it's 50-50 if the Russians can encircle this big Ukrainian concentration of troops, and if they do it, it's a big game changer. So we shouldn't be too optimistic seeing this amazing resistance what Ukraine have put up. We shouldn't be too optimistic about the weapon systems we are sending, because any major weapon system is much harder to use. So it's pretty easy to use an anti-tank rocket. It's not rocket science. I'm sorry for this very bad joke. But to use the Russian system is extremely different from the Western system. So, and the Ukrainians know the Russian systems. But the self-propelled artillery, Western tanks, whatever they get, they have to be trained for basically weeks are not enough. So for a longer time, so I would say that if Russia is more focused, if there is let's say luckier weather patterns for Russia, it can be very bad for the Ukrainian troops there. But I mean, until now, the Russians underperformed so badly that anything can happen. But still, I'm a bit more, a bit less optimistic than many other Western observers about the long-term chances of the Ukrainian army. For sure, 3 weeks not going to be enough. So May the 9th. Putin may celebrate the capture of Mariupol. I'm sure that he can celebrate that, but that will be a very bitter celebration because of the thousands and thousands of graves, new graves, which will be next to the graves of the Second World War, the graves of Afghanistan, the graves of many other conflicts. And actually, unlike the Second World War, and very much like Afghanistan, it is a war of choice. So Putin can thank to himself for this catastrophe.
Can I just add something just real quick? Because
Sure.
that was a very, very prudent assessment. I agree with everything you said, and particularly the point that actually the longer the Russians wait, the more likely they could put together a better campaign. But two things. One on Mariupol, I don't know this for sure, but I'm guessing that the port facilities in Mariupol are not in very good shape, which means that you would have to do logistics over the shore, which are very, very difficult. And I think after the sinking of the ship, the Russians are going to be much more risk averse. So I'm not really sure they're going to be able to exploit port facilities in a significant way anytime soon. The other big one is, at least we hear this, is that there's a lot more active intelligence sharing with Western, particularly the US. And the one big weakness of the Russians is what we call intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. The ability to look deep into Ukraine. They haven't really demonstrated that. That's not going to get any better. Conversely, if there is increasingly robust intelligence sharing, that's pretty significant. And that will actually really help the Ukrainians a lot. And then, conversely, the longer you take to set up your campaign, the more valuable the intelligence will be. So it's very dynamic. I think Till raises some really, really excellent points, and we shouldn't be confident either way. But it's no free lunch for anybody, for sure. Sorry to interrupt.
So to wrap up, we have understood that the current crisis poses very serious challenges to Europe in particular, more generally to NATO. The choices being made in these weeks will have a lasting impact on our societies and economies, as well as on international politics. I hope this debate has been helpful to our audience in clarifying their minds on the subject. Certainly, Dr. Carafano, Dr. Demko, and Mr. Picchi have addressed it with great competence and frankness. Many thanks to our three guests for being with us.
Thank you.
And I wish you all a good day and see you soon.